Well, hey there, everybody, and that catchy theme song tells me that it's high noon here in Chicago, Central Standard Time, that is. I hope you all set your clocks back. That means it's time for yet another Ball Publishing webinar. I'm Kris, editor of Growertalks and Green Profit Magazine and the e-newsletter Acres Online, and I'm going to be your host for the next 50 minutes or so as we tackle today's topic, Step Up to the Plate and Grow a Better Liner. Interesting title, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, as usual, I'm not the expert on the topic, but who is? Well, we've got two of them today, and for the first time ever, both my experts, all my experts are sitting in the very same room with me rather than broadcasting live from the beach or some lovely park or wherever they happen to be doing it. And the first expert here is Mr. Kris Carlsson, Product Manager for Ball FloraPlant. How are you, Kris?
I am good. Disgruntled A's fan. Yeah, very much disgruntled, but happy for Jason's Kansas City Royals. We're going to introduce next.
So we're getting into the baseball theme thing here, huh? All right. So, who is this Jason guy of which he speaks? He's a happy guy because he is a Royal fan. Please welcome Jason Twaddell from Ball FloraPlant.
Thank you, Kris. Yeah, I'm a happy guy. You know, we had a good night last night.
Yeah, the grin you're wearing right now.
Yeah, champions. It's good stuff.
And you're dressed in the full garb, the necktie, and everything.
I put on everything blue that I had, so I'm good.
Right, and meanwhile, poor Kris over there is...
You can gloat today, but on Friday it's a different story.
I don't know.
So what is it, though, with the base? I mean, here you are, even in the promo picture here, in the videos that we did together, in the production guide we put together, baseball everywhere. How'd that come about?
You know, we're both big baseball fans, and so it's sort of a common ground for both of us, and we were able to apply it to what we were trying to do here. So it worked out well.
All right. Well, and who am I? Well, as always, I'm your host, broadcasting live from the controls at the Ball Publishing Broadcast Studios just west of Chicago. And I could have taken a fresh picture and you'd have seen two other guys squeezed in right next to me there. It's a little cozy in my office, but, well, we made room. Anyway, and we've got to thank our sponsor, Ball FloraPlant, for whom both you guys work. So you probably just ought to thank him for the paycheck.
Yeah. Oh, I'm happy. I'm happy with everything right now.
Kris is like, what, you got a paycheck, Jason? Of course they do. Anyway, all right. Now, a couple more little housekeeping things. As always, if you've got questions for these guys as we go along, use the chat the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen. There's also a Q&A area, but the chat area is a little bit easier. But regardless, as we go along, we'll field the questions.
Good one.
Unless they're way off topic from what we're talking about, or we might do some privately, we'll save some time at the end as well. And if something happens, if a customer comes or whatever, and you can't stick on, fear not, our webinar is archived at the same place you signed up, ballpublishing.com/webinars. So, that said, you guys ready to go?
We're ready.
All right, take it away, Kris and Jason.
Let's get started. We were talking in the video series, we were talking spring training, and that's what we want to highlight here. We're talking the early phases, the planning, the preparing, and the receiving of your cuttings coming in the door. And the goal of this video is to help you shorten that time from the box to the bench. I'll say it again, from the box to the bench. We want to eliminate any unnecessary time in getting those cuttings stuck on your bench. This is an important phase of spring training, getting prepped for the season, and that's where Jason and I were making our baseball analogy. We love it so much, we thought we could play with that a little bit in the presentation. So we're going to look at some essential factors that you need to look at before you stick your cuttings. And real quickly, you know, planning and preparing, that's part of it. Handling and sorting, the prioritization of the cuttings when they come in, what type of mist should they receive, how should they be grouped together, and then also sanitation. So we're also going to try to cover that from the respect of a small grower to a large grower. So when we look at that planning and preparing stage for the arrival, again, shortening the time from the box to the bench, we want to look at a weekly checklist. So for a small grower like me, a weekly checklist, what day as your cuttings come? It's simple as me. I have a binder in Arroyo Grande, California, where I run the facility, and each week we know what cuttings are coming in our binder, and it's just our ball seed order acknowledgments of what's coming in for the given week. If you're a larger grower, you may be looking at a computer program where you're getting all that entered into the computer before the cuttings arrive so that you know what's coming on what day. Who's your carrier? That's usually pretty easy to figure out. UPS, FedEx, whatever the carrier that's coming in, you want to know and know approximately what time they're going to be delivering those cuttings. Is your prop house ready? You know, that's key in this step. Are you up on your maintenance for all the misters? Are your boilers operating correctly? Make sure your prop house is ready to go and that you have the space for the cuttings that are coming in. Is everything sanitized? Is your labor prepped? Labor is a key one. It's not only are all the people there, but are they trained properly to get those cuttings stuck the right way? And then finally, trays available and your cooler ready. So trays available, we want to make sure that we have the trays on hand at least a week in advance. I run on a month in advance. As a small grower, I'm ordering trays in, so I need to have a little bit of back stock. If you're making your own trays, we'll get to the tray manufacturing later. Maybe you can have a little longer or shorter lead time on how soon you get your trays in and ready to go. And then, is your cooler ready? Do you have it turned on? Is it operational? Is everything prepped? So now our cuttings have arrived, and Jason's over there still gloating about his Kansas City Royals and how good they are, and we're going to go to the cooler.
All right, so once your cuttings have arrived, now we need to do everything we can to store them and sort them out the best that we can. So you see the arrow pointing over to our cooler. Boxes are here. Let's get them into that cooler, and let's cool them down. So we're going to talk a little bit about best management practices for storing our cuttings. The cooler environment is a really important thing, and what we want to do is maintain this cold chain. We call it the cold chain. It's what happens as soon as we take our cuttings at our facility in Las Limas in Nicaragua. So as soon as we take those cuttings off the stock plants, we immediately start to cool them down. That's what we call the cold chain. We get those sent off to you, and what you want to do is then maintain that once you receive them. So what is the right cooler environment? Well, we want to have a nice consistent temperature control. It's really important that our cooler not only is set at the right temperature before the cuttings come in, as Kris talked about in the last slide, but we want to minimize any big swings in temperature, because those big swings can really minimize not only the storage life of the cutting, but then how well it performs once it gets into the propagation house. One thing that you really want to try to do is cool that cutting down so that you can maintain a turgid cutting and reduce any respiration so you can keep the energy in that cutting. Another thing you want to do is have a high humidity. So inside of your cooler, you can have a dry cooler that is not necessarily a good storage environment, even though the temperatures are right. So how can you increase humidity in your cooler? Well, you can install a fog system. You could wet down the floors with a hose, or you could even put a wet newspaper on top of those cuttings as you after you unpack them and get them out of the boxes.
We've got a question that popped up from Jenny, guys. She wants to know about the day the cuttings are arriving. Is this something that she can know weeks in advance, something known days in advance? Do we contact Ball FloraPlant to find out what that arrival day is?
I'll say that's a very good question. What we can do now is we can use WebTrack. So if you're familiar with WebTrack, you can get on there and actually track your shipment, and it'll basically just be a UPS or FedEx tracking where you click on the truck and it'll show you where that cutting is in its transportation phase heading to you.
But that's after it's shipped.
Correct, and
that means you'd only know within 24 hours or 48 hours.
Correct.
She's wondering how far back can you go on that date.
You can get further back if you request for a specific day for your cuttings to show up. There's certain days that the farm's harvesting, and you can request for a certain day to show up. So our day in Aurora Grande is all our cuttings always show up on Wednesday. So we don't typically track the FedEx or the UPS tracking number because we consistently know that on Wednesday at 11 a.m. our cuttings are showing up. If they don't, then we go and track it and try to figure out what's going on.
So you can get to that level of detail. If week 18, Tuesday, you know it's going to be, and probably 11 a.m. or whenever the UPS guy shows up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to cooler settings. So really we want to talk about what is the right temperature. We want to have a cold cooler, and we want to have a high humidity in our cooler. But what temperature do we want to put it at? So, you know, there's a couple of different levels of storage temperatures you could have. You know, really for most growers, they have one cooler if they have a cooler at all. So you're not going to be able to have different zones. But if you are one of those growers that has multiple zones in your cooler, you have 2 different coolers, you can store your cold storage crops. You can see on the left-hand side there some things like argyranthemum or calibrachoa, geraniums. You can store these cooler, 45 to 50 degrees. I mean, ideally, geraniums you're storing around 40. You can keep those nice and cold, and they'll hold up better in the cooler that way. But for most crops, we're going to be in that middle zone here with the warmer storage crops, 50 to 55. That's kind of the ideal spot. It hits the middle of the road for most crops. And then you do have a few outliers out there that you want to keep an eye on. So something like purslane or basil, these are a cold-sensitive crop. You don't necessarily want to put those right into your cooler if it's set at 50 degrees.
And actually, I had a question for you, Jason, and somebody else has a question about cooler temperatures. In Arroyo Grande, we only have 1 cooler, so we can only have 1 set point. So I was wondering if on these cold-sensitive crops like basil and purslane, would it actually be ideal potentially to prioritize sticking those earlier if possible if you're working with small batches so they never touch the cooler?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's a good way to do it because these items, you don't want to put them in the cooler. You don't want them to sit in the loading dock where it might get cold, might be close to a door or something like that. You want to just go ahead and get those to the line and get them stuck. That's a good way to do it. So it is something to keep an eye out for. Make sure that those cold-sensitive crops don't end up in the cooler with everything else.
Otherwise, it seems like if you only have 1 cooler, put it at 50, store everything except the cold-sensitive stuff, and you're splitting the difference, yeah?
Yep, and I think that's the best way to go. You know, just set your cooler between 50 and 55, and you should be in good shape for the vast majority of the vegetative annuals you receive. And then this photo here, I wanted to just put out there for you guys to see that there really is a direct correlation with the ability to keep that cutting turgid and store it well until you can get it stuck. And so what this photograph shows is that on the far right-hand side, we've got a New Guinea patient that stayed saturated from the time it arrived at the grower. And then on the far left-hand side, you've got one that was actually allowed to dry overnight. And then, of course, you can see in between there, you can really see the difference in the rooting of cuttings that remained turgid the entire time versus the ones that were allowed to dry down. That's why we're emphasizing this shortening the time from the box to the bench, because if we can't maintain a turgid cutting after you get in the prop house, it's really going to impact how well your cuttings perform once they get in there. Okay, and then sanitation starts now. And we talked a little bit about sanitation in the planning and preparing. Kris touched on it a little bit. Is your prop house sanitized? Is your, you know, have you cleaned out all your filters and done all of that stuff? But really, at this stage, we want to make sure that the sanitation is ready for what we would call material handling phase. So you're starting to actually handle these cuttings now, and you want to make sure that you've got sanitation protocols in place, right? And you want to make sure those protocols are in place before the cuttings start to arrive. And once they are there, make sure that your workers have barriers, things like aprons or gloves, and they have spray bottles with the sanitizer that they can use to clean their hands off in between boxes that they've opened up. You know, make sure that your benches and the carts, the trays that you use to sort your cuttings out, make sure that those have been cleaned and sanitized between each use, not just on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. That's something you want to do each day whenever you use them.
I was at an offshore farm last week, and I went through 12 foot and hand baths in a space of about 100 yards. That's how important sanitation is to the folks who produce the cuttings.
Absolutely. Yeah, we put a very high premium on sanitation, and you should do the same thing within your own facility. You don't need necessarily 12-foot baths. You don't have to take a shower when you go into your own facility.
Yeah, I've never been so clean in my life.
But the important part is that you actually put a premium on sanitation, and that you make sure that you carry that all the way through your production, because it starts right now. We just got in a question that says, what are you spraying for your sanitizer? So, you know, most growers are going to use a quaternary ammonia, some kind of oxidizer like that. I think that's a really good place to be for a sanitizer. Other growers might be using something that's a viricide, something like Virkon, that will control viruses as well, but maybe you don't have quite as good a control on some of your other diseases. So I think really for you got to find what works best in your facility, but those quaternary ammonias are really, I think, the best place to start in terms of your sanitizer.
That's what we're using in our foot baths, and most of our sanitation is using that.
So something beyond just bleach and water, in other words.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to move on to prioritizing, sorting our cuttings out. So our cuttings are here. We've got them in the cooler. We're storing them appropriately. Now we need to prioritize and sort these guys out. And there's 3 steps or stages in this prioritizing and sorting. First, it's the sensitive crops. We want to get those prioritized. They need to be at the top of our list. Then we want to group by mist requirements and group by rooting time. So I'm going to dive into each of those here a little bit. So step 1, we're going to prioritize sensitive crops. What does that mean? What that means is we need to get those crops that are high priority items out of the box quickly and get them stuck. We want to stick these cuttings on the same day that they arrive and whenever that's possible. So this picture on the on the right-hand side, you can see is Thunbergia. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen, what you see there. And Thunbergia is one of those crops that does not transport well, and so it needs to be at the high end of your sensitivity list or your priority list. So what we encourage you to do is follow our BFP priority list. This is a list that we put together. We are actually going to load that onto the website, so you can find it there in the culture section of our website. But then there's a small list here that I put together on ethylene and storage sensitive crops. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with some of these and some of the things that happens if these guys get, they get stored a little bit too long. So something like euphorbia or geraniums, lantana. These are all crops you want to stick same day.
And I was going to just say, we're doing small runs in the facility out in Arroyo Grande, California, and we've actually prioritized these to where we try to not have them touch the cooler. We try to stick them right out of the box if possible. Now, we were kind of talking about that earlier about stress on cutting. Sometimes to get them turgid again, the cooler can help you, but if you're on a normal shipping time, these don't touch the cooler for us. They go straight to the prop house and stick immediately.
Yeah, and if you know when these high priority items are coming in, you can take them right to your sticking line or to your propagation house, get them stuck right away. I think for a lot of growers, especially our larger growers that get a lot of unrooted cuttings in 1 week, it's going to take you several days to get all these cuttings stuck. And so I think it's important at that point that you really prioritize them out so that you're doing the right crops the day they arrive. Because there are crops that actually hold up quite well in the cooler. So step 1, prioritizing. So then the next step is to group these cuttings. So we've taken the cuttings that are high priority items, very sensitive cuttings. We got them stuck first. Now we've got an opportunity to group some. We've got a question here. Do we have to open all boxes when they arrive or open as we advanced propagation? I assume that means open as we take them to our prop house. I think it's good for growers to open boxes and see where they are in terms of temperature. So a lot of growers use an infrared thermometer to see what kind of condition the cuttings are in when they arrive. I don't think there's a bad thing to open the boxes. It's also, if cuttings arrive in good shape, it's not a bad thing to just keep them in their boxes for a while because it's actually a pretty good place to store the cuttings.
So we have a rule in AG and Arroyo Grande to open all the boxes because even the cuttings that do store well and don't have ethylene sensitivity, you're letting that ethylene get out. There is a little bit of ethylene buildup, so the sooner you can open that box and let the air move, it is better.
Yeah, I agree, and especially at crops like, the high sensitivity crops, right, our high priority ones. Geraniums would be probably the biggest one. Get those boxes open. Let that ethylene out. Okay, so we're going to talk sorting them out, I'm sorry. So we'll start with grouping our cuttings, sorting them together by mist requirements. Okay, so to me this is the next level of sorting our cuttings out. We want to put crops with specific mist requirements together. So crops that are in stage 1 and stage 2, which would be from the time the cutting is stuck until the time that we can get that cutting off of mist and move it out of that propagation environment, that's stage 1 and stage 2. Crops that have the same mist requirement should be grouped together. It allows you to do a better job of propagating those items. And then the second layer of grouping is to group crops with similar rooting times together. So rooting our grouping by mist requirements, in general, there's 3 categories. There's your high mist crops, there's your low mist crops, and there's everything sort of in between. It kind of falls into a bigger bucket. For high mist crops, these would be items that, crops that need a higher mist frequency to stay turgid. We all know that we want to keep a nice turgid cutting, especially in the first few days of propagation, because if we don't, it actually really decreases the efficiency of our, or the effectiveness of our rooting. So high mist crops, Angelonia, Osteospermum, Scaevola, you want to group those together so you can have the same mist strategy. On the opposite end of that spectrum is our low mist crops. things that have silvery leaves or succulent type leaves. These are items that don't need nearly as much mist. You don't want to have them under the same mist strategy as your high mist stuff. So definitely want to make sure we group together for success. And then the next step would be grouping by rooting time. So after we've grouped our mist requirements together, we want to group stuff that roots quickly together with other things that root quickly as well. So in general, we've got 3 groups. We've got a fast rooting group, a moderate rooting group, and slower groups. But you guys, as growers or propagators, you need to build your own groups based on your facility, on the experiences you have within your propagation house. And really, to further explain how it helps to group by rooting time, what you want to do when you group stuff by rooting time is you want to be able to wean cuttings off of mist at the same time, eliminate that night mist at the right appropriate time. It also allows you to efficiently move product better. You can see in the photo here on the right, this is what a propagation house oftentimes looks like as you go in and you start pulling out the cuttings or the liners that are ready to move out from under mist. And you end up with a lot of holes, and this is a lot of work to consolidate. So if you group things that root together, then you're going to be able to move stuff more efficiently and create bigger chunks of space in your facility.
Jason, we've got a question about high and low mist, whether you can define that or whether it depends on sort of your facility.
Yeah, it's very difficult. Depends, on the facility, depends on the weather that time. It depends on the crop. So, as far as mist frequency goes, if you put everything under the same mist regime and you see stuff that's wilting much faster than others, they bump up into your higher mist requirement group.
We can talk about vapor pressure deficit, VPD. It's what we use in Rio Grande, California. We've got a lot of sun and a lot of temperature all year round, and so our mist comes on for about 4 seconds, and we can go as high as every I'd say about 5 minutes when it's really sunny and warm out, because the vapor pressure deficit is such that you need a lot of mist. You're losing humidity because of the temperature and the light, and so that mist frequency is automatically increasing because of the computer's telling it to. Now, if you're a propagator that doesn't have a sophisticated computer program, then it's what you were just talking about, Jason. You just got to watch the cuttings. If they're wilting too much, then you're not misting enough, and there's a balance there. Because if you have free water, that's what we talked about in the videos, free water on your cuttings, that's a bad thing, and then you need less.
I was going to ask how you know when you've given it too much. But that means when they're sitting there basically covered with
water droplets coming off the cuttings, and just you can see water on it. You don't really want to be able to see water on the cutting, but you also don't want to see wilted cutting. So there's really a balance there.
You got to pay attention, in other words.
Yeah, correct. This specific question asked about an example of 6 seconds every 30 minutes. Is this a high or a low mist frequency? And for me, that would be, with sunny conditions, that would really be a rather low mist frequency. So that would be a crop that didn't need quite as much mist.
All right. How about booms versus stationary mist? Any preferences? Does it matter what kind of mist you're using as long as it's good, fine mist?
Yeah, I mean, ideally what you're doing is you're trying to control the environment. And, when we get into the Friday webinar, we're going to talk about stage 1 and stage 2 and the ideal environment within those stages. But for me, if you can increase humidity without actually putting a lot of water on the plant, that's the best way to go. So something like fog or, higher up 4-way misters versus booms is a good way to go.
We've got high up 4-way misters in Rio Grande. It's about, I'd say, 4 or 5 feet off the actual bench. So you're really not getting water on the cuttings. You're just keeping the humidity high in the propagation area.
And that's really the key, right?
Mike, you got to tune in on Friday, buddy, to get more info. That's who asked the question.
Yeah, good question. All right, so then here's some examples of rooting groups. So what we would consider fast, moderate, and slow. So fast groups, they root quick, 4 to 5 days. Moderate groups, 6 to 8. Slow groups might take as long as 14 days. So group these guys together so you can give the same mist strategy. All right.
All right. So now we're done with spring training, and going back to our baseball theme, we've hit the preseason, and we want to look at all the different things to ensure a good start in the greenhouse. So that includes media, how you're going to produce your trays or manufacture them, and make sure that they're properly filled, and all the different factors that go into the prep work before that cutting is stuck. So if we switch to the next slide here, we're just going to jump into some quick essential factors. I mentioned some of them already: uniform tray manufacturing, proper soil moisture, before and after sticking, the correct dibble, and rooting hormones. So we'll just jump right into tray manufacturing. And really here, you're trying to evaluate if you have the right equipment to play the game. And obviously, Jason, the Royals did. They prepped in preseason, and the A's just didn't have the right equipment. They couldn't get there. So
there's no doubt we were well planned and prepared, and we had all the resources we needed.
Still making me mad, but I'll move on. Let's get back to trays. So your choices would be a purchased pre-filled tray, or the ability to create your own in-house. And we're going to look at some quick differences and why you would choose one over the other. Now, pre-filled is obviously a good option because you don't have to do the work, but the drawback is you need to hold those manufacturers to a high standard with weekly quality checks. That's what we do in California, is weekly, or at least every batch needs to be checked for quality so that you can ensure that you have high quality soil and trays that you're sticking into. I find it expensive to bring in the pre-filled because as a small grower, I have to order a large quantity, and then I have too much backstock that sits for too long in the greenhouse. Ideally, I don't really want trays sitting around for any longer than a month. So the option to create your own gives you that control over the timing of how long your trays sit in the greenhouse, and gives you control over the quality. However, now the responsibility is on you to make high quality, consistent trays every single time. So let's keep rolling. Some essential factors to look at when you're filling trays. Let's say you choose to fill your own. Let's say you're going with loose filled trays and you're filling all those cells, trying to make sure that they're the same volume and you get the same compaction rate and everything. Sometimes it's as simple as making sure your brushes or your screeds are working properly and changed enough to where everything's working like it should to fill those trays well. And then if we look at LA pots, when you look at an LA pot, you can see the trays on the right-hand side in the picture. You want to make sure that those were manufactured for you uniformly, or you manufacture them yourself uniformly. If you have too high of an LA pot, it's going to wick water away from the cutting. If it's too low, you don't have enough soil volume in there. And another thing to look at is, you can train your guy who's filling the trays to fill these the right way, but if your staff doesn't know what it's supposed to look like, they should be rejecting this tray. So when you see these red circles here, your whole staff needs to know that that's the wrong kind of tray, and when they see that, they shouldn't even stick it. They should just set it to the side and not use it.
I think that's a good point, is that, even if you're buying in your own trays, you want to hold those people to a very high standard, whether you're, making them yourself or not, but the uniformity of your liners and, when you want to grow a better liner, it all starts here at the tray manufacturing. If you don't make a good tray or create a good tray, then your uniformity is already out the window.
As important as tray manufacturing, I think, is soil moisture, and you're going to jump in and talk about the soil moisture of our trays before and after sticking.
Yeah, so this is another essential factor, something that's very important. You want to start off with the right soil moisture. So what does that mean? It's level 4. We use a 1 to 5 soil moisture scale at Ball. And so what 4 is we call it medium wet. It's not completely saturated, but it's not so dry that it might actually pull some moisture out of that cutting. So it's really important that you've got the right moisture at the time of sticking, and also, or before you stick, and also after you stick it. So, a really good way for you to determine what the ideal weight is, or what the ideal moisture is, to put an ideal weight on that. So it's a way for you to train your staff. You can get your trays to what you feel like is the level 4 ideal moisture level, and then weigh those trays out. And then that way, you've got a little bit of a metric that you can put with your production staff. They can know that this is exactly where I want to be when I stick these cuttings. It's really important to remember, don't stick your cuttings into dry soil. So don't leave anything to chance. Put a little bit of metric on there, and weigh those trays and make sure you know you've got the right moisture when you stick the cuttings. Another very important factor that I feel personally gets overlooked quite a bit is dibbling. Dibbling correctly is a really important part of growing a better liner. It's not always a huge thing for every single crop, because some crops you can, throw them on the ground and they'll strike roots. And other crops really need a safe landing place and good soil stem contact to do well. So what are some of the problems that come with dibbling incorrectly? To me, this is the biggest one, is this lack of uniformity that can be created. So you can see at the bottom of this picture, there's a calibrachoa cutting with a calloused basal end, and it's got a few roots just starting, versus further up the tray towards the middle, you've got roots that have already elongated to 1 inch. And really, this entire picture tells the message of uniformity of dibbling and soil stem contact.
Are you trying to point out again how bad the A's were at preparing and planning and preseason and making sure we have a good start?
So that's, you're saying that's the A's down there at the bottom?
I think it is.
You're kind of calloused now, in fact, aren't you?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good way to point it out. Yeah, sure.
But truly, so the one on the bottom had no soil, or not enough soil contact around that stem. The one in the middle, better, and the one at the top was the best.
Yeah.
There's that much difference.
Yep, and so the way these trays were dibbled, they were dibbled much deeper on the outside edge of that tray, and because of that, when those cuttings were stuck, they didn't bottom out.
So it's just depth, it's not even diameter.
No, in this case it's depth, and it's a very important thing to remember and consider when you're talking about certain crops. Lobelia and calibrachoa are two that I think are the biggest when it comes to soil stem contact and the importance. So as far as managing your dibble, the size and the depth, you want to dibble correctly. Another thing you can do to put a little bit of metrics to what we're doing as propagators and this manufacturing process is to measure the stops on your dibble board. Every dibble board's got these stops where you can make sure that you're dibbling to the appropriate depth for the crop. So you can see the slide ruler there in the picture set to whatever that is, maybe 25 millimeters. I knew when I built that I had the appropriate depth for the dibble for the plants that I was sticking. And then another thing to consider is the size of the pen. So you can get a dibble with a 1/4 inch pen or a 1/8 inch pen, but all plants aren't created equal, right? So we've got things like geraniums or bracteantha have a very large stem. They don't necessarily need the same dibble as a angelonia or a Bidens or some very small wispy cutting. So make sure you're using the right tool to get the crop grown successfully and that you're dibbling with the right size dibble pen. Okay.
Great. The next topic we want to talk about is obviously rooting hormones from the slide that you can see. And this picture is a really great illustration of juicing and not juicing. Did I say juicing? Were you trying to, again, show me that the A's didn't juice on the bottom line here? The cuttings didn't root? Did your two teams juice a little bit with the hormones before they were going into the season there?
Clearly we had the right hormones.
All right.
We were juicing. So.
All right. Well, the good news is for growers is you can actually legally juice your cuttings, unlike in baseball where it's illegal. And the picture here is osteo white lightning, and the top row are rooted liners. And the treatment that was done was 1,500 IBA parts per million spray, actually before the cuttings even came to the customer. It's done at the farm because we recognize that this osteo white lightning benefits from rooting hormone. And obviously the cuttings on the bottom didn't get any rooting hormone at all, and you see the difference in speed and consistency of rooting. So those are some of the key things that we need to talk about when we talk about rooting hormones. So obviously rooting hormones are a tool. They don't have to be used. Not all crops benefit from rooting hormones, but for difficult or slow to root crops, it's a great advantage to increase the rooting speed and the uniformity. And you can do this in the form of sticking the stem of the cutting into the rooting hormone before you stick it, or there's also even overhead applications that can be made once the crop has already been stuck to improve that efficiency of the cuttings rooting. So we just want to remind you that anytime you can use a tool to increase speed of rooting and uniformity, you should consider it as a propagator.
I think, Kris, just to interject for a minute, that rooting hormones, they're a great tool to use. Not every plant needs it. Things like verbena or, double impatiens, they root really, really well without any rooting hormone. But if you can take even a day off of that mist requirement, if you can make it root in 5 days instead of 6, it's worth examining the benefits of rooting hormones. So the faster we can get them off mist and standing on their own 2 feet, so to speak, the better we are.
And we do want to mention, too, that we have resources on ballflooraplant.com with a crop list of what crops are benefit from the rooting hormones, and also some recommendations of what can be used. We're going to get into a little bit more into the different forms and what we can use. Before we go too much further, I noticed there's a question about from Jesse about possibly not dibbling at all.
Yeah, and that's a good question. You know, it really kind of depends on what's being stuck, what the cutting is, and what the media is, or the tray choice, right? So if you've got let's say you bought in Elepots and they were manufactured 2 months ago and they've been stacked on a pallet, you know, it's going to be really hard to stick a cutting into that without a dibble. Now, conversely, let's say that you just ran your liner tray through your flat filler and it's a loose-filled soil. You really don't need to dibble that, because it's nice loose-filled soil, and it's going to be really easy to stick that cutting in. You know, so there's a couple reasons why you dibble. One, it's a safe landing place for the cutting, but two, you know, it just kind of depends on what the media is. If it's hard and really compact, then you really have to have that dibble.
And Jenny's asking about specific depth for Lobelian caliber color, which she has a tough time with. Is it really just based on the length of the cuttings that you're receiving, and make sure the basal end gets to the bottom of the dibble? Is that really the rule of thumb? That's
right, and then make sure that also it's secured in there. So if it's too shallow, the cutting's not going to be secured. If you move it to your propagation house, the cutting might fall out. So it has to be deep enough to secure that cutting in there, but not so deep that it doesn't actually bottom out.
Really, you want a depth that the stem is going down to the soil, where a leaf is not going to be touching the soil line. So if your cutting comes in with, you know, 1/4 inch of stem before the first leaf, that's the portion that you want in the soil.
Now, ideally, there's a good stick foot on that unrooted cutting, but there's a lot of cuttings that can be stuck a little bit deeper, and if that one of the leaves is a little bit underneath the soil, it's not the end of the world. So.
All right, so getting back to rooting hormones, I just want to explain the purpose of a rooting hormone. Jason was talking about not all cuttings benefit, but some plants have trouble switching from making stem cells to root cells. So the purpose of a rooting hormone is for the hormone to switch those cells from making stem cells to callus and root cells. That's the easiest way to put it. And we're looking at basal end applications first for rooting hormones. And first, we're just going to look at the different powder options there are for applying the hormone to the basal end of the cutting. The first two that we're looking at are Rhizopon AA, which can be bought in as a powder. And in Aurora Grande, we were using Hormex #1 for the cuttings that we needed on. The preferred method is to use a duster and only touch the stem or the tip of the stem when you're sticking. That way you're not getting any powder on the leaf or any other part of the cutting, just the tip of the stem. A little bit of rooting hormone goes a long way, so you don't need a lot. We don't want a thick, you know, coat on the stem tip. Just a little dusting will go a long ways. We in Aurora Grande use very small containers to dip into. We're talking about don't dip right in the container that you bought, because there's a sanitation risk there. We use very small containers so that anything that's left over at the end of the day gets discarded, and we actually change small containers in between batches of cuttings to eliminate that risk of sanitation. Then we can also look at liquid applications as they relate to rooting hormones, and you can be applying IBA as much as 500 to 1,000 parts per million in the form of a dip and grow or a Rhizopon AA. Again, these would be sprayed using a handheld sprayer to the basal end of the cutting or the tip, and you don't want the solution to get on the stems or the leaves. And again, don't stick directly into that solution. The next thing to talk about is spraying rooting hormones over the top of the crop after it's been stuck. So this is an example. You can see the picture of our Geranthemum where we sprayed IBA right over the top of the crop after they were stuck. It's a really cost-effective way to get the rooting hormone on the product. You have to do it as I would say a sprench. We set up there, it's a coarse spray, but I call it a sprench, where some of that liquid is getting down to the stem of the cutting. Fortis IBA water-soluble salt is another commonly used product at 50 to 300 parts per million. You can see here the Geranthemum has some leaf curl. That's a risk of using the spray-on applications, because if you don't get the rate right, you're going to see a little bit of phyto. But if you test your rates in your greenhouse, make sure you find the ones that work for you. crops generally grow right out of this. So.
Yeah, that usually looks bad initially, and you get a little worried about it, but it grows right out of it. Not really an issue long-term in terms of the crop performance.
Yeah, if you juice just enough, you can win the World Series, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, apparently we're a bunch of cheaters.
Oh, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Some other considerations for ensuring a good start are surfactants. So we want to recommend potentially using a surfactant to break that surface tension on the leaves of the cuttings. That will improve every mist cycle so that more humidity and moisture is taken in by the cutting rather than just beating up and running off the leaf. So we're recommending capsule at 1 to 4 ounces per 100 gallons, and to spray it really quickly right after stick. We say within 24 hours. We're spraying within hours after stick in Arroyo Grande. And I also want to bring up another way that you could do this is we actually in Arroyo Grande have been experimenting with surfactants mixed with a broad spectrum fungicide as a tank mix. You have to work with the rates, test in your greenhouse before you use it, but it's a really great way to accomplish two things at once. First, break that surface tension with the surfactant and get that broad spectrum fungicide down so that you have that protection right off the bat.
Yeah, one thing on that is just make sure that your whatever fungicide you're using doesn't already have a wetting agent in it or a spreader sticker. So you want to make sure that if you are adding capsule to it, that it's not a risk. That's correct.
The next thing we wanted to talk about is refer you to some specific information that we've been noticing. A lot of growers are using Paget intrinsic fungicide. They're finding that this reduces stress on the crop after they've stuck it if they spray it. So we've put some links up there. You can download the webinar and go to those links. And there's a lot of research done that all the way through the production cycle that these intrinsic fungicide will protect the crop even once it's shipped to retail. It's holding up better at retail with these applications.
Yep, there seems to be some specific improvements that could be made, or it just increases the rooting speed and reduces the stress on that cutting with the Paget. So definitely something to look at.
Okay, so now we just wanted to quickly run through and kind of wrap up some of the essential factors of ensuring a good start and getting your cuttings off to the best start you can to make a high quality liner at the end of this propagation process.
Yeah, so this is basically sort of a summary, right, of everything we just went through. So, we'll just kind of check them off real quick. So planning and preparing correctly. It's really important that we plan out what we're doing from 1 week to the next. Properly storing our cuttings. We want to minimize any moisture loss. We want to maintain a nice turgid cutting as we're getting into the prop house. Sanitation, make sure you've got sanitation protocols in place in your facilities. Very important. Grouping and prioritizing. When you get those cuttings in, make sure you're putting the same mist requirements together. Make sure that you're prioritizing your high sensitivity items for success, getting them out of the box and stuck quickly. Uniform tray manufacturing. This is an important part of what we call the manufacturing process. Uniformity starts with that tray. Make sure it's very strong foundation for your liner crop to get off to a good start. Soil moisture. This is obviously a huge factor all the way through the crop production, but you want to start even before you stick that cutting. Make sure you've got the right soil moisture. Put an emphasis on dibbling. Make sure you dibble well, and utilize rooting hormones anytime that you can. I mean, any tool that we can use as a grower to improve our chances of success is a really big deal, and we want to pull out all the stops to make sure that we grow the perfect liner. So just about cover it?
We've got quite a few questions coming in.
Okay.
I'm really excited for you that your team won the World Series. It's a great example of when you do the right planning, preparing, you got the right personnel, the right tools. You feel good at the end of the year.
It only took 30 years. Since the last one. So.
Which shows that no matter how inexperienced you guys are, you can get better at this, right? There's hope for you guys and for Kris.
For the Oakland A's. Maybe next year. Yeah, maybe next year.
And the Cubs as well.
But if you follow this guide, you're going to win the World Series every time. That's the point.
That's true. It's good. We got the performer right here. So let's let you guys answer a few of the last questions that we didn't already cover. Greg wants to know about light quality and intensities And we're going to cover that Friday, right, guys?
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about light after we've stuck the cutting and gotten into the prop house, really. Yeah, we will cover that on Friday.
Because it's a big topic. So, Greg, hopefully you can attend. If not, we will have it archived. Do we need to look at using capsule with pageant?
Yeah,
Do you know?
You know, that's a good question. Here's my suggestion on using pageant is to read the label. Like with any chemical, read the label, and on that label, I believe it discourages using capsule with pageant. I'm not saying that you can't, and that maybe some growers do it with success now. I don't know that. But what I would say, follow the label, okay, and make sure that you're doing whatever is on there.
All right. A good media mix to use. This will be another hour-long seminar or webinar, probably for your own plugs, your own liners. Any media recommendations?
If you're filling your own trays, I mean, really you want to make sure you've got a mix that provides good drainage, good aeration for those cuttings so that you can avoid a saturated media. You know, one thing you don't want to do is use say a plug mix that you're using for 512s in a 100 count liner tray, right? So we're talking about liner trays here. They're most often going to be bigger cell sizes, so you're going to have a little bit more of a coarse mix. I don't have any specific recommendations of any specific mixes that are out there, but just make sure you're using something that's for a little bit larger cell size.
There's a lot of good ones out there. I would contact your suppliers in the area if you're going to buy in your pre-made trays and find out what they're using. Look at what pH, what EC is already coming preloaded in the media. That's another important thing to factor into it, because some manufacturers are already sending you a charge of fertilizer in that media. Sometimes that can be beneficial, but then you got to know it. You got to know that that's what's coming.
All right. How about mycorrhizae? We were talking about sort of some other things you can do, apply to the crop right after sticking. Is that something you dealt with, know anything about?
I do have some experience using the mycorrhiza. I've seen it be very beneficial. I think it's a preference thing. I mean, I've talked to some growers that look at it just as another cost that goes into producing their liners, and if they can get away with it without another cost, they'll sometimes explore without the cost. But as what Jason was saying, if it's a tool that can take a day or two off your rooting, you should look at it and weigh the options. We have such high light in California that we root faster than what you would expect, so we don't use mycorrhiza, but we did test it out and prove that roots would appear about a day earlier. So for us, it wasn't needed, but if you're struggling, it could be something to look at. Okay.
It might be something more applicable when finishing the crop than for what we're talking about here for just the rooting of the cuttings. A couple of questions on water. The first is a soil moisture guide for after sticking. Willie wants to know.
Well, that'll be something that we'll cover again on Friday. We'll go more into soil moisture, you know, in the greenhouse. But that level 4, that's where we want to start from the time we stick that cutting and get it into the prop house.
All right. Water quality. The best you can get, I would imagine.
That's a big topic. You know, water quality obviously is very important. We want to make sure that, you know, when you're misting your cuttings, having water quality that is, you know, let's just say if you're from 75 to 150 parts per million of alkalinity, that's a good place to be because it's going to maintain a pretty stable media pH. But, you know, there's so many different types of water out there. That's a really big topic. It's hard to cover.
Does it need to be better than your finished production water because you're doing something as delicate as rooting a cutting? Or if you've got good enough water to grow a good finished pack or 4-inch, wouldn't that be okay for rooting?
If you're producing a lot of unrooted cuttings and doing a lot of propagating, I think it is a bigger emphasis to have higher water quality. So you're going to put more emphasis on it. If you're just producing a finished crop and you've got borderline water quality, you can live with it. You can find ways to work around it.
We acidify water in Arroyo Grande for our propagation zone because we're running at about 125 parts per million alkalinity, so it's a little higher than we want. So we found some ways to work around that to improve our water quality on the propagation side. On the finished side, there's a little more flexibility, but really it should be I think it should be the same or very close to the same.
Yeah, if you can, for sure.
All right, let's see. Hillary says they noticed some phyto when they used capsule and pageant together.
Well, there you go. Real world experience right there.
All right, and let's see. Jeff says, we dunk all of our unrooted cuttings in a tub of Steiner Nema, which is a nematode, root shield, and Botanigard. Thoughts on that, gentlemen?
That's an interesting dunk. You know, I mean, if it works for you, it works. You know, I think for me, it's always a big sanitation risk to commingle lots of URCs in the same tub of whatever. Now you've got Botanigard in there, you've got root shield in there. Does that give you all the protection you need from a pathology standpoint? Perhaps. But yeah, for me, it's a sanitation risk, I guess.
We've experimented with the nematodes, and we did sprays over the top so that we didn't have that risk of dunking the cuttings together.
Yeah, and I think nematodes are a fantastic way to control fungus nets in the greenhouse in your prop house. But when you put it with these other items, maybe that's a good way for you to control, you know, any diseases that might come in.
Yeah.
So it's a good question. If it works, keep doing it, Jeff.
All right. Now, somebody wants to know for Friday, if we get talking about specific crops, touching on herb propagation. He's having a tough time with lavender and rosemary. Based on what I know about what you guys will be talking about Friday, you're not getting into specifics, but is there anything you can offer Jorge about herb propagation, especially those two crops?
When I've done successful herb propagation, I've done a little bit of mist in the early stages, and then I've actually built a small tunnel tent where the humidity stays really high. I get a lot of heat in there, but I'm actually not misting the cuttings anymore because it takes a long time to root, and I think a lot of people struggle with how long it takes. They keep misting it, and then their rosemary or their lavender starts to rot out. So that's one way on a crop that takes a long time to root. You need to get the water off of it, but you need to keep that humidity high, and you're a small grower. Just make a little plastic tunnel over the top of the bench. You can keep that humidity high, get a lot of heat in, and get some roots moving.
So even Diana has even said, keep it dry on the herbs. So I can see if you're having a tough time, oftentimes the tendency might be to add water, mist them more frequently, and you're just adding to the problem.
I think as propagators, we struggle when a crop isn't rooting. We think it still needs mist. And while it might still need high humidity, it doesn't necessarily mean it still needs mist.
And based on what you said earlier, the purpose of the mist is humidity. It's not the moisture. It's not the water, per se.
Right. That's what
that's something to remember, I think, when you're misting your crop.
Yeah. And we'll get into stage 1 and 2, ideal environment on Friday, but that's why it's important to have high humidity. I mean, if you can put fog into the air and create that high humidity, it's better than putting mist right on top of the crop.
There you go. All right, last question here. Back to media. Difference whether you're using a flood table or a mesh table. I don't think you'd want to be flooding your cuttings anyway, would you?
Yeah, and I think the question here is, do you want to have a different media type if you're on a flood table versus a mesh table in propagation? And I don't know that it matters. I mean, if you're doing you know, the things that you need to do from a culture standpoint, then I don't know that changing the media type is something you need to worry about between those two.
Certainly there would be an airflow difference. You don't have, you know, flowing up underneath the bench, and but you don't think maybe a lighter soil or anything like their media.
No, I mean, I think if you've got a media that works well in the liner tray you're using, then that means that you've got a kind of a porous mix that works well for that tray size. And I think that's probably the best that you're going to be able to do, you know, regardless of what table you're on, you know, whether it's expanded metal or a flood table, right?
All right. And you don't think that any considerations just for rooting in general? We talk about that Friday when it comes to bench type, because I don't know if that came up even in the video.
We don't really talk about bench type. I mean, ideally, you know, like you said, you'd like to have some more air movement between there. A flood table doesn't give you that, although it may give you a better platform for, you know, more uniform heat across the you know, the liner trays that are on that table. So
it could be both. Yeah, we have it in Arroyo Grande. We have tables where we have wire mesh, so we get lots of airflow around the cuttings. We have other benches where we actually have plastic on the bottom of them, so we keep that humidity in, but on those benches we're not misting on top. So we're just keeping the humidity by creating that tunnel and creating an enclosed environment.
All right. Well, if you have more questions, the guys, and I'm proud of you guys for not, well, I'll talk about that later. More questions. Here's their email addresses. Carlsson at ballhort.com and Twaddell at ballhort.com if you've got specific questions. And as we have alluded, there is another webinar, part 2, where we're going to cover some more of these things. Not trees and shrubs, though, as somebody asked. Camellias.
No.
We are not going to be getting, sorry about that. However, ask them, shoot them an email. Maybe these guys will come up with something.
Yeah, we can try to help you find an answer.
So this coming Friday, November 6th, same time, same channel, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard. And you can sign up for it if you haven't already, and I know a lot of you have, at the same place you registered, which is ballpublishing.com/webinars, which is the same place. Within an hour or two, you will be able to find this webinar and all of our others archived. And I want to thank Ball FloraPlant again, the sponsor of this webinar. And if you want more information on this topic, because that is where you can find the 4-part video series, which I tell you, you got to watch it. It's really great quality information, every detail you can want. You see it pretty much live in a really good greenhouse. We were out at Van Wettering on Long Island, and some great baseball banner too. So that, along with the handbook, is all on the same topic, is all available at ballfloraplant.com. So
I'll say one thing about the, we put the supplement out on in Growertalks, came out in what, September?
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken. If you as growers want to have more of those supplements, you can contact us. We'll send you more of those so that you can have one for every grower in the facility.
There you go. And I wanted to thank you guys for not like having some sort of a dugout emptying brawl in the middle of all this. You're sitting next to each other. I'm off to the side. I may have to sit between them next time if Kris doesn't get over the angst of having been beaten so badly.
Well, the A's used to be in Kansas City. We're both small market teams, so we have to root for each other.
They used to be in Philadelphia, actually. But anyway.
All right. On that note, as the banter, as the trash talk continues, for Kris and Jason and the A's and all the folks at Ball FloraPlant and Ball Publishing, this is Kris Beatties saying, see you there.